just like to welcome everyone. We've still got a few people late joiners joining us. As I said, this is the first event of our Flow 2021 Photography Festival. We're beaming in from Italy and from Stirling in central Scotland. I really would love to welcome Morag along. I know we can't see her. Hopefully we'll get to see it at some point in the evening. Morag's going to talk us through her work, and she's going to focus on work that she did in the Southern Uplands of Scotland. And I'm really looking forward to her sharing that with us. Morag and I first were introduced back in, about 2018. And we've been talking about Morag getting involved in the festival since then. Of course, last year was a bit of a write-off, and we weren't able to run the festival quite as we'd planned. But my connection with Morag actually came through my brother, who's dialed in from Tasmania. When Brett was a lecturer in Yorkshire, he did quite a bit of work with Joe Cornish. And when working with Joe, he came across a piece of work that Morag and our partner Ted were working on called Xero Footprint. And it was that piece of work that led me to pick up the phone and call Morag and see if she would join us at the Stirling Photography Festival. You're going to love what you see tonight. Morag's work is very experimental. She works in different media, and we're going to look at some of that tonight. So we're going to ask you to use your chat function to pick up links and things. So it's going to be interactive in that sense, so we can share other media with you. And that's where Megan is going to talk us through the key stages in the process, when we have to go into chat and pick up links that Morag's sharing with us. So Morag is an experimentalist. She encourages people to be confident in their work and to be playful, and hopefully we're going to see that coming through in her work tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Morag. And Megan will pick up during the course of the programme, just pointing us to chat to pick up links and things. So Morag, can I hand over to you now, please?
Yeah, thank you, Janie. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and to Megan too, and everyone at the Stirling Photography Festival for inviting me along tonight. As I've said, we've had some techie issues, so we're just hoping they'll settle down. I'm presuming you can all hear me. Will you give me a nod, Janie? Great, okay. So I'll try and share my screen here. In addition to the housekeeping Janie's already gone through, my mum is here tonight, so no swearing in the chat, please. Keep it clean. 2 seconds while I try and get this up. And Janie, perhaps you can just give me a nod to say that's okay. You can see my screen, all right? Great, fantastic. Okay, so just I've got you and Megan in the top of my screen there, so perhaps you guys could just holler or wave your arms around if anything goes wrong. Yeah, fantastic. So as Janie already said in her introduction, my husband and I, Ted, we work together as photographers, and we live between Scotland and Italy. But tonight, because we're in Stirling, I want to keep it all Scottish, and I'm going to show a range of projects and pictures that are captured along our local waterways. So most of these are found within an easy walk from the house where we live. I find it quite hard to describe why water's got such a magnetic pull for me, but it is something that, you know, I'm continually drawn to photograph. It's where I always go to be calm and to be happy if I'm feeling a bit stressed. And so hopefully you'll get a sense of that in the images that I'm sharing tonight. I'll share a few insights about what inspires the photographs, and I'll also talk about my processes a little bit. I'm getting a lot more process driven as I kind of move forward with my practice. So sort of slightly less focused on the finished image, although it's obviously nice to have, but the time spent outdoors with or without the camera is also really important for incubating creativity for me. So there's going to be quite a few digital images that I'll walk you through, and then we're going to watch a short video together. And then after that, I'm going to talk about some of my dabblings in alternative processes. So hopefully I'll get a few chances to catch my breath in the middle of all of that. And I'm gonna be, throughout the talk, hopefully I'm gonna be promoting the case for building connections with the natural world. You know, and as far as I'm concerned, I think that's one of the really important things we can do to help with the climate and the biodiversity crisis, is to build these connections locally that help us pay attention to what's going on around us. And as the lady said, there's going to be plenty of time to have a little chat afterwards, or you can interject your questions in the chat throughout. So I'm going to kick off with a set of work which I've called here loosely Impressions and Other Watery Abstracts. And the Impressions project, it's a collaboration with Ted Leeming. It goes back a long time, actually, probably 15 or 16 years ago we started this. And the great majority of the shots we took for this project, and all of the ones that you'll see tonight, are taken along one short stretch of river that was very close to our old home in Dalry. It's the place where we walked our dog every day. It's the place where the kids played. Just a small stretch of river with a suspension bridge over it. And we started developing this type of photography. It wasn't very widespread at the time, so we couldn't find resources about it anywhere else. It's called intentional camera movement, or impressionist photography. And so for anyone that doesn't know that, you create images by moving the camera while you take the exposure and using a slow shutter speed. And so you're really taking the scene in front of you, you're looking at the light, you're looking at the texture, and then you're adding something of yourself by bringing movement into the image. It's a really playful, interesting way of working that offers a lot of opportunity and diversity. You can take shots of things that don't ordinarily look interesting and make a really beautiful picture from them. Even something like a pile of sticks or the gravel on your driveway can make a really interesting photo using this technique. And I work with Kaisa Siren, who's in the audience I see, from Finland, and Stephanie Johnson in the States. We have a kind of community that we do a lot of this work, and I think there's a few folk from there in tonight. So if anyone's interested in that, it's something we can, you know, point you in the direction of more resources. The nice thing about this project particularly is that we could go back there every day. We could go back twice a day if we wanted. We could go there for hours and hours on end, just being in the same place through different seasons, watching the light change, and really teaching ourselves this technique at the same time. And that's really underpinned a lot of the photography I've done since. I want to be able to have that connection and to keep going back to a place. And it takes the pressure and stress off always having to get a finished image when you're out working with your camera, because there's so many times you're going to be out with your camera where you're not going to get a good image, most of the time, in fact. And a lot of people, when we're teaching, can get really stressed if they don't feel like they're nailing something there and then. And it's trying to get across that idea that, you know, you need to build those images, and the times that all of those times when you don't get the image you want is actually going to end up in an image, whether it's a day later, a month later, or 10 years later. You know, it's all worthwhile. You're never kind of wasting your time, as it were, if that makes sense. So you've got another shot here. These are all taken probably within 20 meters of each other, the ones you've just seen. And I'll describe this one a little bit because it's slightly less abstract than the others. We've got the River Ken in the foreground, which is on the hydroelectric system, which will come up repeatedly throughout this chat because it kind of underpins all the waterways in our valley. And then you've got the riverbank and you've got the trees reflecting, and you can see the building there in the background as well. So we kind of played solidly with this for a couple of years. You know, there were just so many possibilities, you know, almost infinite really. And then that, working with that really painterly abstract technique, we started also looking at other ways of shooting water abstracts. And so without going much further away than where we were originally, we would go away and look at all sorts of burns and rivers. And really, you know, some of these are tiny, you know, that might be a trickling rock pool on a beach, or it could be what's filling the frame there could be a piece of water that's no bigger than my hand. So none of these were great big rivers or anything impressive on a kind of grand scale. And so some of them would be more impressionistic like this, and looking at drawing colour from either the rocks, the undergrowth vegetation around. You can see the highlights on the water where the light's interplaying with the surface there. And anyone, you know, who's sort of spent any time in Scotland will know we have this beautiful peaty water as well that can add a real colour. You saw it in the opening slide. That one always reminds me of a kind of waterfall of champagne. And you start to get the sense of some of these browns here. Part of the browns here are actually autumn leaves in the bottom of the stream. So that gives you the colour that underpins the image. And then you've got all this texture from these, you know, bubbles cascading down the stream. So it can be just hours and hours hanging over the edge of a tiny river, taking these with my macro lens on. You know, there's so many iterations to this one tiny piece of water, so many places where the texture changes, where the flow meets, where it steps down over rocks. And this one, conversely, is it's just a puddle. You know, it's just laying down, because obviously the reflection in a puddle changes with your angle to it. And, you know, seeing this whole world in there, you've got a sense of the bottom of the puddle, you've got the sun reflecting in it. You can't look at the sun at that time of day, but if you can capture it in the puddle, you then get all the beautiful colours that come out from it, and also including some vegetation in there as well. And often also working just with these tiny sets of bubbles. And you have to be careful with these, because obviously you end up in the photo yourself, reflected in the bubble. And that can make a real difference if you forgot you were wearing a bright green or a bright red jacket. You know, your bubbles are suddenly full of your jacket colour, which can be interesting as well. But in general, I just get completely lost and mesmerised by all of this. For hours on end, I have to, even when I'm talking about it and looking at the pictures, I have to guard against just wandering off into my imagination. These ones are, you know, using the kind of surface tensions on the water and the interplay with the light. And again, getting much closer in and using all of that texture that exists in that little world. Using the reflections of the trees so that you can see through to the bottom of the river in places. And then you get these areas where there's some sort of pause in the tension of the flow. And you get something that almost looks like a window into the back of the stream. And this is the sort of thing that could lose half a day on really easily. It's not actually an amazing photo, but I wanted to, you know, put it in just as it's one that illustrates that water movement really well. And then, of course, you get the times where there's just a shaft of light comes through the trees or the undergrowth and lights everything up in a kind of golden or green or yellow colour. And these times are rare that this would happen on. This is a tiny little waterfall on a mossy stream, you know, and it's only happened to me once or twice, and you just get this incredible colour that, you know, isn't manipulated at all. It's just how it was for that moment. And then we have another burn, which is it's it's on a suspension bridge which crosses another one of the rivers affected by the hydro system, and there's a time of the year in the fresh spring flush when all the leaves are just out on the trees, and it may be 11 o'clock every day for a certain period of time. The water just is bright green. The whole river, everything you can see into the distance is just, and again, this isn't a fantastic photo, but you get the sense of everything you can see as that colour, and it literally just sort of stops you in your tracks. And actually, it's one of those places that I could, if you told me I could only photograph for the rest of my life from this one bridge, I would be quite happy, because it's so different every time I go there. It's not the bridge I was talking about earlier, just out of interest. This is nearer to where we live now. And you can go there and some days it's bright green like this. You can go there and it's black as night. You can go there, the sun's reflecting or the moon's reflecting. The trees are all different throughout the day, the way their reflections sit. And then obviously you have days where it's a really deep churning torrent when the water's being let down, and other days when you can see all the rocks in the bottom because, you know, they're short of rainfall and the dams haven't been letting as much through. So, was there any questions came up, Megan? Sorry, before I move on.
There was one from Francesca asking, do you use a polarizer to see the leaves at the bottom of the rivers that you photograph?
No, I don't at all. I mean, I know a lot of people do, but, you know, I'll quite often try and make a shadow from myself if I need to, or try and use reflection, or the shadow, sorry, off trees or other objects to do it. But yeah, it's not something I use at all. I think it's one of those things I tried when I was first doing photography and didn't get on with it. And so it's never gone on the camera again. But it is a really useful tool for shooting that type of work. And I was also going to say, if people were sort of particularly taken with any of that work and want to look at other photographers that do it, Michaela Griffiths, I can never say that name properly, is really worth looking up. She has some great kind of macro and abstract water work. I think you've got the link to share for that. So I'm moving on to a project called Ode to Pluto. This was probably a big turning point for me in terms of, it was really where I became much less goal orientated. For the first few years of kind of being a professional photographer, I was still quite obsessed with, you know, what the image I was taking was and what I was getting, whereas this was much more something where walking and cycling and running came into the work a lot. And so all of those experiences were really building into my artwork. And this is a pretty introspective project, this one, and you can probably tell from tonally it's a little bit dark. But it was exploring where we can find feelings of comfort, safety and cohesion in the natural world, you know, which goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. It's obviously got huge implications with respect to mental health as well as physical well-being. And I guess, you know, over the last year, that's become really crucial to people and a lot more front and centre than perhaps it was before. This ability to find somewhere that you can connect with on a daily basis. So I'm only showing a few photos from this project and then there's the video. But most of them were captured on a piece of land that we refer to as the island, which is a hillside forestry plantation that sits between two rivers in the hydroelectric system. And, you know, it's somewhere I know like the back of my hand. I go there, you know, with my dog, with my kids and my bike, and just spend a lot of time wandering there, noticing the changes. And kind of as I cross that bridge to get over to the island, I just slip into a sort of more meditative state. And generally I don't even take my full frame camera for wanderings like this, I like to just have my iPhone with me, or a compact camera, so that I can just not feel too encumbered by kit, and just be able to, you know, grab a photo of whatever catches my eye at the time. So there's water again. This is it's just one of those swirls of foam that you see on the water, and I got quite into playing with exposure during this series, so I would expose for the white and let everything else go completely to black. And that's something I've continued with plants and other subjects as well, but it was particularly prevalent in this body of work. So they're actually all colour images, as you can see from there's a tiny leaf in there somewhere, and just using the texture on the water again and the light reflecting off it to create these kind of, what for me are fascinating patterns and textures. This one was actually just it's a boggy puddle with a load of moss growing in it. So obviously it doesn't kind of look like this to the naked eye, but I could kind of visualize what it would look like if I, you know, took it in this sort of extreme exposure way. And to me, this is really reminiscent of, you know, space and time and galaxies. And I think at the same time as I was doing this project, I was doing Dark Sky Ranger training with the Biosphere and I think it was the Forestry Commission at the time. And so there was, you know, there's a lot of those concepts of space and time and astrophysics floating around in my mind. And I think they perhaps had an influence on me choosing to present this work in such a sort of stark black and bright light way. So actually, this is where we're going to go to the video, Megan. So if you could share the link in the chat. What we're going to do, because we've had streaming issues, it's easier if you all don't mind clicking on the link to watch the videos in your own browsers, and then we can come back and rejoin afterwards. So this is an audio visual from the same project, Ode to Pluto. It's all still taken from the local area, with the exception of 2 or 3 tiny clips from Iceland that I can bear to leave out. So yeah, you know, watch it, get immersed in it, put your screen on full and just be still. Or, you know, you can go make a cup of tea as well if you're needing a break already. And what I did want to ask is, if anyone's wants to add any comments in the chat of what sort of emotions or reactions it evokes for you, I'm quite interested in the concept of then trying to respond to your thoughts and reactions in a future piece of work. So there's no pressure to do that at all, but if it does put something quite strongly for you, then, you know, let us know, and it would be interesting. I can take a note of that and maybe use it later.
So we have a couple of questions as well, if you want to answer them just now.
Yeah, sure.
So someone was asking if you use an ND filter to lengthen your exposure time, and do you see yourself as a photographer or an artist?
I do use an ND filter as and when I need to. I used to use one a lot more than I do these days, but they are super handy things to have, you know, for sure, especially if you do want to do these longer exposures. I would have always said I saw myself as a photographer, but probably more an artist now, I would say, because although most of my work is rooted in photography, I do, you know, I dabble in mixed media a little bit. I'll make installations. But then having said that, even when I do that, I tend to go back and photograph them. So there's the long-term output can be a photograph. But yeah, it's one I get asked a lot, that, and I'm not sure I've really got the right answer to it, if that makes sense. Well, I'll crack on then, because I've got a few things to get through. I wanted to say just at this point, you know, at the beginning of that video, I mentioned that, you know, there was a few clips from Iceland there, and I wanted to point out that counteracting that exoticness, there's also just photos of wind rippling across, the video footage, sorry, of wind rippling across a really muddy, horrible puddle, you know, and it's every bit as beautiful and valid as interesting. And I wanted to drop into this part of the talk a couple of books that I have found really wonderful and inspiring to read about kind of building the sort of curiosity and wonder of daily observations and fascinations and delight. So the one I've read most recently, I've only just finished it, is by Dara McNulty, and it's called The Diary of a Young Naturalist. And it's a really wonderful kind of journal type book of his observations. And then the other one that I read a long time ago, but still really resonates with me, and I read it over and over again, is The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd. And I think Megan's going to pop those in the chat for you. And I can't recommend, you know, digging out that type of reading enough for kind of building your creativity if you're a photographer or an artist. So I'm actually going to skip over this project. It's called Bad Algae, and it's actually a work in progress anyway. So it's just 3 images, and they're all multiple exposures of pollution, waterways, human pollution, I should say, waterways and dead things. And there's a kind of overall concept I'm going to work towards a project on called Bad Algae, but because I think we're in danger of, you know, getting near the time mark, and because it's an incomplete project, I'll just show you the pictures and skip on over them. And so I'm going to move on now to Xero Footprint. So this is a project that Ted and I have been working on since 2009. It came about because we spent a year or 2 project managing our own house build, and we were so immersed every day in all of the research that was required to work out how to source your materials environmentally, you know, which ones were best to come locally, which ones made more sense for longevity to import. All of these decisions really kind of took over our lives. And as soon as we finished that, Ted said, why don't we do a photography project that kind of also reflects that? And so we very literally chose this Xero Footprint concept where every photo had to be taken from exactly the same spot outside our house in Galloway, basically just outside our kitchen patio. And as you'll see again, the hydro scheme comes back. It's kind of ever present. And we have this, you know, it is a beautiful view. So we took these photos over, well, we're still taking them, but we did make a book after the first 5 years with probably only 50 of, you know, several thousand images made it into the book. And what was interesting about this was we had to rely really strongly on weather to create good compositions for the images, because although it's a nice view, it's not actually photogenic in its own right on a large scale. Just the way the landscape sits doesn't sit well for compositions, if that makes sense. So we would have to wait until, you know, some fog rolled in or some clouds, and that would frame the landscape completely differently for us. And also the light would have a huge impact. So, and what we didn't realize when we started this was that obviously when you do a project over the space of 5 or 10 or more years, you start actually documenting a lot of changes, environmental changes in the landscape, whether that's deforestation, afforestation, you know, windstorms coming through and damaging the environment. We've had fires, floods, all sorts of things have happened kind of right in front of our window, and we see this progression as, you know, we move through the years with our photos these days. And, you know, just typically for me, just get obsessed with watching the light change on the water, really. You know, so photographing it in every different scenario. That's lights from the cars going along the road on the other side. And then I've allowed myself to step slightly away from that 1 meter restriction now. So this is 3 meters away in the greenhouse. And this is working with the frost that we get on the windows. Only in the winter, you know, when you get that really hard frost, and you just have an hour or two maximum before the sun comes up and melts it from behind. And so this is just using that frozen water. And that's in the background there, you can see the landscape and the sun rising up behind it. And, you know, playing with the patterns. And obviously even from 5 minutes to the next 5 minutes, these are changing because they're melting slightly, and different patterns are emerging. And that's another version of that. And then also on our land in Scotland, we've planted a lot of broadleaf trees, handful of conifers, and where we've disturbed the land to build the track to the house and the track around a pond, which is what you see here, there's a huge amount of natural regeneration come through. And it's extraordinary how quickly this has established itself. So there's willow trees, which are much bigger than me, whole groves of them, you know, they're starting to form a canopy. And so this is 20 or 30 meters from the original point, and I'm starting to work with that, and also using the impressionist technique to look at some of these habitats. And there's going to be quite a few projects come out of this, because obviously there's a lot of topical discussion these days around land use. So this is the beginning of something new. So moving on from Xero Footprint, we got given the opportunity 2 or 3 years ago now to do an artist residency through the local arts organisation Upland, and funded by Creative Scotland. For anyone who doesn't know, when you get an artist residency, generally you're getting a remit, probably, that can be tight or it can be loose depending on the organisation, and you're being given time and funded time to pursue a project, which is, it's a real luxury and privilege in terms of being able to work in that way. You know, because quite often certainly as a photographer, you're either working to a very tight brief or you're selling your work after you've created it. So to have this real chance to experiment and play and research was wonderful. We had to do a lot of community engagement on this as well, which was fantastic. There was myself, Ted, and 2 other artists called Jason and Kat working on it. And we went into men's sheds, we went into youth groups, we worked with everyone at the school from the nursery age, which was a really funny challenge. I hadn't quite worked out the attention span of your average 2-year-old when I went in to do that session, you know, and right through to the high school kids. But, you know, it was great to be able to experience it through all of those different people's views and eyes and opinions. And so we did a whole heap of research of all different types. You know, we researched the environmental side of the renewable energy, the economics of it, the history of it, and the building of these dams. There's these fantastic stories of all these. There are communities of navvies all around the area, you know, that lived there in the most brutal conditions, you know, in the winter months, building these dams. There was a cycling reverend who used to go around attending to their spiritual needs. And so for something that we looked at every day or had been a big part of our lives for getting on for 30 years, I guess, in my case, it was suddenly this opportunity to really re-examine it and get to know it even more than I had before, which was fascinating. So in terms of making work, after all of the engagement and research phase, we had an exhibition to work to, which was called Pennies from Heaven, which came from a quote from one of the people at the time that it was being built. And I got the chance to start exploring the cyanotype process, which is something I'd wanted to do for quite a while, and just not had that time to set aside to do it. So I felt like using the cyanotype and the Prussian blue that you get for that was going to be perfect for working with a piece around water. And so through the community sessions, I was inspired to make this map of all of the waterways that fed into the hydroelectric system. So this is everything from the tiniest little headwater, you know, that comes out of a spring high up in the mountains, right through to the big, you know, water storage reservoirs, and then the rivers as they come through and down out towards the sea at the bottom there. So in the top of that, you're in the uplands, and you gradually get more into the lowlands. And it was a real side effect of this for me that I hadn't expected as I set out to do this piece of work, was that as I was sketching those lines on the map, I was completely flooded with memories, because obviously I've spent so much time on all these waterways over the period I've lived here. You know, I had memories of, you know, being pregnant with my kid and the other kid, you know, splashing around in the burn when the night before I was due to go into hospital. We had, you know, thinking about hiking up to festivals in the hills 20 years ago when the Knockengorrick Festival first started, fishing up on some of these lochs, eating blueberries, walking with friends, you know, some of whom aren't here anymore. You know, it was just absolutely full of memories for me, and there's so much of that embodied in this piece. And I was going to say, you know, for anyone that doesn't know about cyanotypes, you basically coat some paper or some fabric or a substrate with a chemical mixture, and then expose either an object or a negative, or in my case, I'd drawn out all of these rivers on acetate and then expose them in the sun, and then you rinse it off and you end up with this kind of reversed image with this incredible Prussian blue colour. It's quite you know, it's a hit and miss process until you work out, till you get used to how to do everything, how to coat the substrate, how long to leave it to dry, how many coats does it need, how long to leave it in the sun on any given day, in any given place, in any given season. So to be able to experiment like this and have time to get it wrong over and over again, which I did for probably 2 months before I actually got this piece right, was wonderful. And I think I was going to reference Marianthe Linus there, because she does amazing cyanotype works, and so if anyone wants to look her up, they could go and check out some of her pieces. I think it's the Wirral estuary she works on a lot. And then this was a spontaneous cyanotype piece that I made right before the exhibition, just in the final week, in response to an artist's walk that we did, that was incidentally along the same stretch of river that you saw in the very first project of this talk, the riverbank where we learned to do those impressionist shots. We did an artist's walk where we we spent some time being silent, and then we sat with our eyes shut and we did some noticing and just had this really wonderful walk along what feels like an old friend, the riverbank at this stage, and then along up to the dam, where we then had a conversation around, you know, renewable energy and the trade-offs with environmental concerns, because obviously these days, if you went to flood a valley to put a hydroelectric system in, it would be a much probably more difficult conversation than it was 100 years ago, or nearly 100 years ago when this one went in. So I just spontaneously made this cyanotype piece using string to try and kind of embody those complex conversations that we had. And then the last piece in that project was this one called Songs from the Stream, which was a set of 3 images and telling a story from the point of view of the stream, kind of observing the really short space of time that humans are actually existing on this planet in a sense of deep time. You know, whereas the water is in this cycle that's been going on for millions of years. And so you've got in the beginning, uproar and beyond. And, you know, the final word from the water and the writing piece that goes with it is that the water's seen other species come and go, which is kind of grim, but it's, you know, probably something we all need to be thinking about quite carefully these days, given the IPCC report that came out this week. And then, was there any questions on any of that? Sorry.
Not on that, but there was one asking, Cameron was asking if you used a technique called dragging the shutter to create any of your artwork.
I don't know if it is called that, so I don't know if it's the same as when I've spoken about moving the camera. I don't know if it would be the same as that. Maybe afterwards in the chat we could ask.
I think someone has put a link in the chat to let people know what it is, if anybody wants to look.
Okay, I'll try and what I'll do is, because I'm scared to touch anything on here at the moment just because of the techie issues before, but maybe once we come out into the chat section, I can open it up on my other computer and then see if it is what I do or not. But yeah, so it's a good one. I'm interested to see what that is. So I was, for this section, this was a kind of natural progression from having worked with the cyanotypes, and then also just every year on year, project on project, getting deeper and deeper into wanting to be more sustainable with my work. So I wanted to try some of these sort of hands-on, low impact processes. This one's called Anther Types. And so for this, you basically, well, for me, I chose to use plant materials. I can't remember if it has to be plant materials to be an anther type or not, but so I wanted to use, I had some fresh berries that were in season at the time, and then I had some sloes in the freezer. So I think there's a mixture of blackcurrants, blueberries, sloes, just a mixture of maybe 3 or 4 different plants that you mash up into an emulsion, spread it over your chosen substrate, and then you expose either direct objects or, again, negatives onto. You have to leave these out for a lot longer than a cyanotype. The process is much slower. I mean, these could be left out anything from hours to a week, maybe even longer, depending on how bright the sunlight is at the time. And then they're not quite as light fast in the long run, I wouldn't say either. So you have to be a bit careful about, you know, what you're going to do with them and how you're going to store them. But it's a really fascinating way of working. And there's a good book that I think there's also a link for that you could pop in the chat. I can't remember if I've linked to the book or the website, but you know, it'll take people in the right direction if they want to find out more. And it's a really good book that suggests so many different things that you can try this with. And it's quite international. So, you know, it doesn't just have plants from one country or other. You should be able to find something that you can use wherever you live, I would hope. And then because I'm a bit extreme sometimes when I'm thinking about these things, I was thinking, okay, so my substrate is still something that's been made or bought in. And so I want to try making my own substrate. So I made some paper from the willow trees that I referenced earlier that have sprung up of their own accord outside our house. And anyone who's cut a willow tree knows it'll grow 5 shoots back for every one you cut down. So I didn't feel too bad in terms of what I was taking. And then, to be honest, if I'd known how hard it was going to be, I wouldn't have even started, because I spent probably 2 days literally stripping the willow. I don't know if that's where the name of the dance came from, but, you know, with my hand and a knife, stripping the outer bark off and then pulling the pith off that sits in between that, and that's what you make your paper from. And it took me a long time. I had the really, really painful fingers afterwards. And I got this unbelievably rustic paper, which you can see the close up there, which, you know, wasn't quite what I'd imagined would come out the other end. But, you know, it's interesting all the same, and it's quite sculptural paper in its own right. It doesn't sit flat, it's full of bends. And you can, if you hold it up to the light comes through it. And so then I coated the paper with the Anther type solution, and then used the leftover willow and the coltsfoot that had been growing under the willow to expose some pictures, which you can see on the left there. And it's a very hit and miss process. You know, you're not necessarily going to get something as clear and crisp as you would expect to out of it, but, you know, it's a lot of fun trying, and at the end of the day it's all recyclable, and it's not, you know, doing any harm at all making it. So it's I enjoyed the process. I'm not sure what I'll do with that next time round if I do it again. And these are just another couple of ideas that you know, people might be interested in trying. I wanted to say as well, I think I gave you a link, Megan, to the Land Art Collective, which is where they run really, really good workshops for all of these techniques that I'm talking about. It's where I've learned some of them. And there's some fantastic photographers and artists presenting these talks on there. So definitely worth checking that out. These are chemigrams. So this is taking light sensitive photographic paper and basically mark making, dousing them, spraying, dribbling, masking off areas. And then we've got honey, turmeric, all sorts of spices in there. There's loads of things in your kitchen cupboard basically that you can use to make marks all over this paper, and they're going to have very different effects. You can see the way they dribble around, and then you expose those to the light as well, and you get really funky, interesting results. And these ones, you know, I think for anyone who gets stuck in lockdown and you can't really go out, you know, there's not much you can do and you're wanting to, you know, think of a way of continuing to be creative. These are pretty simple, as long as you've got a pack of photographic paper in your kitchen sink to be able to rinse them in. You know, you're good to go with these. And the other thing on the Land Art Collective, in the workshops, they'll tell you the most environmentally sustainable way of doing all of these. So for example, we've got cathanol developing on the right-hand side here. And this is actually a photogram of it's hornets, dead hornets. We had to take a nest out of our chimney and I felt really bad about it. And so I wanted to do something with the hornets, not that it helped them. And then developed it in cathanol. And then when you go to dispose of your developing fluid, it's got traces of silver in it, which is obviously not good to put down the drain. It's harmful for aquatic life. And so you can put a piece of copper pipe in there and let it sit for a few days, and that takes the silver out of the fluid. And then obviously that can then be recycled or used some other way, or at the very least not be tipped down the drain where it's going to do some harm. So they're very, very conscious of all of those elements, and go out of their way to tell you ways of doing it as well as you can. And on the left here, we've got soil chromatography, which is you get some laboratory paper, coat it in light sensitive fluid, and then you get a bunch of soil samples and you mix them with a little bit of water and sodium hydroxide, and you wick it up the middle where you can see the holes are. And so basically that fluid spreads out across the light sensitive fluid. And then when it's dried, you put it outside and it exposes like this into these incredible patterns and textures and colors. And I'm told that there is, these are scientifically usable in some circumstances. You could measure some of the nutrients or chemicals in your soil by learning to read these and see where the coloured rings are, what colours are there, how far apart all of these little textured patterns are, what they do at the tips. Every element of it is readable to somebody who knows how to analyse soil using this process. So I haven't learned to read them properly yet, but I've taken soil samples from everywhere, and I'm planning to think of what I can do with them later. And I was going to say, so for the developing on the right there, Melanie Cat-King does really good workshops, and she on Caffeinol mint tea developer, and Hannah Fletcher does really good ones on the soil chromatography, and Megan's going to share those with you in the chat as well, hopefully. These are a couple of solar graphs, and you make these by taking, a good base is something like a beer can or one of those tall Coke cans, and you cut the top off, put some photographic paper in it, close it all up again, and you have one little pinhole on the front, and then you tape it up to something or place it somewhere it's going to stay still, and then you leave it to expose. And so these are exposed over 6 months, and that what you're seeing there is the sun rising and setting over the 6 months and how high or low it is in the sky depending on the season. You can see on the right hand side that one's obviously dropped at some point, so you've got 2 different places where the sun goes, and the one on the left you actually you can see the landscape in slightly more detail. The little blue strip across the middle there is the loch that is in front of our house. So again, that's another kind of version of those images from the Xero Footprint position. And again, lots of resources online for how to do those. You can do them with the moon as well. And you don't have to leave them for 6 months. You can do them over a much shorter period if you want to. And again, Melanie Cat-King runs workshops on that fairly regularly, I think. This is another way of working that I've been doing over, I think it's 18 months now. An organisation called Arts Territory Exchange was setting up remote residencies for artists based very rurally or in wilderness areas. And so I was really delighted to get paired with Katie Craney in Alaska, and which is somewhere I'd absolutely love to go. If I hadn't sworn off flying for life, it would probably be the first place I would go. And so, having this opportunity to interact with somebody, through both of our artwork, our landscapes, and talking about, we talk about the ice and how the landscapes were formed by the ice a lot, and bat around a lot of ideas about what we're doing, both working very locally to where we live. And it's just a really, really wonderful way of having that interaction with somewhere else without actually going there. It's still a work in progress. We've just had some work, and I forgot to give you the link for this one. I'll try and give it to you afterwards, in an exhibition curated by, I think it's the University of Huddersfield, about climate action and visual culture. And then we're also going to be doing a joint talk in an Iceland symposium that's been postponed until October, because Iceland is also somewhere we've both spent time over the years, and so we have these shared experiences. Her name is Katie Craney, and I would really recommend following her or checking her out. She's called @Deciphering Change on Instagram, but Megan's got the link to her. And if for nothing else, her reading suggestions on Instagram are always absolutely on the nail. The latest one I read that she sent was On Time and Water by, I'm going to say his name wrong, Andri Snæ Magnusson, who's an Icelander. And there was a quote from that book, which, if only I could find it, is trying to see and experience everything is a bad habit. Some things should just be left alone. And that's something that's really resonated with me over the last few months since I read that book. And it's something that is kind of circling around in my head a lot and affecting my life choices a little bit, actually, to an extent. So yeah, I would definitely recommend looking her up. And obviously I'll keep you posted on how the project goes. And this is just a quick slide saying what's next, which is us, Ted and I are both kind of looking at forests, bogs, land use and the just transition, which are huge topics, especially in Dumfries and Galloway at the moment. There's a lot of afforestation going on, and then a lot of talk about how much we should be protecting peat versus planting forests on peat, and how we get to net zero in a way that is right and benefits everybody. It's a huge topic, and so we're doing a lot of work on that, both from a sort of community and activism point of view and from the art and photography side. So that's just kind of put in there as a watch this space slide. And actually the other thing I wanted to say there, while I remember, is that if anyone wants to get in touch about that, anyone has any experiences they want to share or wants to talk about it, has any ideas, I would love to hear from people. So please do get in touch. This was just a little slide I put together for people who maybe want a little bit of inspiration. But I think it would probably be more valuable to go to having a chat. So because there's going to be a recording of this, people can play it back later and have a look at this slide in their own time. And then I did, Ted is going to be expanding on quite a few of these ideas in his talk on Wednesday. So I think it might actually be sold out now since I put this slide in. But if you haven't got tickets, you can always catch up with it on YouTube later on the Stirling Photography Festival channel. So I think that's me for now. You'll probably be glad to have a little ear rest. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll risk putting my video on to hopefully have a bit of a chat with everybody. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Morag. That was wonderful. I'm feeling quite relaxed and sort of somewhat sleepy now. And thank you, Megan, for navigating through all the tech and the sharing of the links. We have quite a big gathering still. I'm wondering what might be the best way to take questions.
I think for now, if people want to put any questions in the chat, I'm happy to read them out. And if anybody wants to have an open discussion about anything, that's something we could do as well.
Yeah, sure. I'm just saying as well, if I can try and get that, what was it called? Delayed shutter piece of.
Yeah, it was up a bit.
Yeah.
Dragging the shutter, I think it was.
Dragging the shutter, that's it, yeah. And thank you for all the people saying lovely things as well. And I was glad to see somebody was saying, I think I've just lost it again, that they'd read Dara and Dara McNulty and Nan Shepherd, and really liked both of them, so that was nice.
Yeah, that was Anne Sproul further down on
okay.
Yeah.
And okay, so somebody's told me that dragging the shutter isn't the same as ICN. I'm just going to go quickly and have a look. So you fire the flash during the exposure and create a double exposure. So no, that's not something that I do, but I'm definitely going to look it up and possibly have a play with it, because it sounds very interesting, actually. Thank you for, was it, well, Cameron Weir shared the link. I'm not sure who said it, who asked the question to begin with. Somebody's asking, have we ever thought of creating images of water from the other side? Yes, absolutely. I've really thought about it, and I just haven't got around to it yet. You know, in terms of, do I just get a waterproof case for my camera? Could my iPhone, which is supposed to be waterproof, stand up to the depth or not? Because I'm told they're not as waterproof as they say. I know Margaret Soraya has been doing some really beautiful work underwater where she's going swimming. She's often up in the Hebrides and in the north, and yeah, it's really inspiring to look at. So thank you for that, Ali. That might, you never know, sometimes when somebody mentions something like that, it just gives you that final nudge that you need to actually go out and do it. So I'll let you know if that happens. So Glenn, Aquapack for my phone. Yep, that's a great idea. I'm going to save that idea. Thank you, William. Anne's still here, brilliant. Or a thick plastic, okay, like a thick plastic bag with a seal. Lovely, I'm going to have a look at that. Glenn Burton's asking, could we give some sense of the amount of movement in the first photos you saw? When I'm taking the impressionist photos, it depends a little bit on how big a scene I'm taking an image of. So for the scene behind me on my background, the movement might be much bigger like this because I'm taking in a lot of the landscape. But if I'm focused in on a piece of water this big, then obviously I've got to do a really small movement so that I don't drag in things from all around that I don't want in the picture. And it also depends on what you want your shutter speed to be, because if you want a longer shutter speed of say like a second or 2 seconds and you do a lot of movement, you can end up with absolutely nothing left in your picture. So there's a few different elements at play there, and there's no kind of set amount of movement. You almost have to work with the subject that's in front of you and work out the right amount. But just for an example, the one behind me, say it was 0.4 of a second, you know, that would be just something like this, and that's it while I'm taking the shot. I don't know if that relates when you're watching it on a screen like this. Whereas if it was a, you know, a shorter shutter speed, I might have to move quite rapidly to get some movement into the picture. So you really do just have to sort of experiment and play a little bit. I'm just, can we elaborate a little bit on the basis of Ode to Pluto? It actually originated from doing a bit of work with somebody that, you know, was just sort of trying to explore that gap. I kind of knew I wasn't really fitting into the landscape photography, the really traditional landscape photography world, but I was sitting in that world. And I couldn't really work out why I didn't fit, if that makes sense, with these kind of rigid rules and everything having to be so structured and done exactly right. And so I was kind of talking through this with somebody a lot. And she suggested just go out and shoot straight away from your subconscious without putting any thought whatsoever. You know, don't put any conscious thought in at all. Just shoot what you see, what grabs you, and make sure you go out and do it every single day. And just by the process of doing that, you know, it led me down this avenue of taking those types of pictures and spending more time in the outdoors and probably slowing down as well, you know, and just doing these walks at the same place over and over again to an even greater extent than I did before. And I started shooting other things in the forest as well that I wouldn't normally have shot, because normally I would just shoot only water and only slow shutter water. And so I started being a lot more quick and busy in the way I shot, if that makes sense. I was coming back with a lot more photos than normal, and almost none of them were impressionist at that stage either, just a handful. I started using a very fast shutter speed a lot, which actually I should mention for the person, I assumed the person earlier was talking about the ICM ones, because obviously they're a long shutter, but the ones where you saw really crisp, bubbly water, they're shot on a very, very fast shutter, you know, with the autofocus and the stabilization on. Thank you, Glenn, that made sense, that's good. Thanks, Gillian, for your question. Ooh, I do as little post-processing as I possibly can. I don't even crop much anymore, although obviously there was quite a few crops in that set because there was a lot of square shots there. But really, I open it up and it goes in, for me, it goes into camera raw between Bridge and Photoshop. And if I'll tweak the contrast potentially, I might tweak the exposure, I'll tweak the blacks and the whites a little bit. I'll just see what they look like. Rarely the saturation, but maybe I might use the clarity slider. I hit the open button and that's it. And if I have to do more than that, I'm almost guaranteed to just set it aside and not go back to it, because it's really not where I enjoy being at all. There's a very few exceptions where I've laid a few images over each other, and obviously that takes a bit more work because you have to decide how you want those layers to interact with each other, and then I might put a different setting on those. But on the whole, for 98% of my work, it's got to be 2 minutes and out. I might do, there's occasions where you need to do a bit of selective lightening or darkening, or you can see in the ones where I've really pulled the exposure back into. But apart from that, you know, because I know there's a lot of people doing incredible work that is more heavily processed and more layering of images. You've got Andy Gray and you've got Doug Chinnery and Valda Bailey making some really incredible work, you know, and I think there's a bit more processing involved in some of those, but it's just not something, I'm just too impatient probably. And I do prefer being outside taking my photos than I do sitting developing them. I've got folders and folders and folders of photos that I've never even processed. It's a very bad habit. But thank you for the question. Cameron's saying, I think you learn the rules of photography so you then have the confidence to think out of the box and break them. And I think that's a really, really good point. You do need those rules, and also you just need to know how to operate your camera. You need to know how the settings work and how they interact with each other, because otherwise when you come to try and do something, you just wouldn't be able to do it if you don't know which setting is going to have which effect. Yeah, and it's probably good for me that I did have an element of discipline at the beginning, because otherwise I'm not sure, you know, where I would have got to in the end. Have I missed anything, or are there any more? I
don't think there's been any more questions, but if nobody has any more questions, we can either discuss, I know you were talking about what feelings came forward in the Ode to Pluto video, if anybody wanted to share anything with that.
They might be a little bit on the spot now, but they could, you know, you'd be very welcome if you wanted in a different situation to go away and watch that on your own again in your own time, and then if something comes up for you, you know, you can always ping me an email or a message about it, because it will probably be autumn before I sort of start thinking about putting something new together with that type of work anyway. Brett's asking, with the ones where the exposure was critical, do I use spot metering or manual? I just use manual. You know, I'm quite, I don't get too stressed about my exposure anyway, as a rule, because I'm reviewing in the LCD what's happening and decide if it's going in the right direction. And so I'll just use the manual meter and under or overexpose, depending on what I'm doing. Cameron's asking, what about introducing light painting into the movement of my photography. I've played with it, but I haven't done it in any serious projects, you know, so I haven't got any images that I kind of show or talk about. And it, you know, it is an interesting one, that, and again, it's something that I'd quite like to have a go with at some point. So yeah, I'll give that some thought as well.
Morag, is it a medium that lends itself to film photography? Is it a type of art that lends itself to film photography?
What, with the impressionist work, or?
Yeah, the impressionist work.
I'm not sure. I've got a feeling Freeman Patterson, who did a lot of this work, maybe used film. But it's not something I've done. And you're obvious. I mean, the thing is, when I'm doing these impressionist images, I might spend half an hour on just one thing trying to get it right, and that involves taking hundreds and hundreds of exposures, trying to get my movement right, making sure I've got all the stuff in the frame I want to have in the frame, making sure the texture's okay. And so for me, it's a very responsive and sort of quickly changing situation, which film I just wouldn't be able to work with. But I do think some people do it with film. And obviously you'd have to be a lot more disciplined. You'd have to really pre-think what you were going to do and have some very strong ideas on that. And that's where I'm hopeless. I don't pre-think things at all. I want to go somewhere and respond to it and see what happens at the time. And even when I do pre-visualize, I'll end up doing something completely different when I actually arrive at a place. I'm just not very disciplined, actually, I would say. I thought that was a new question, but I don't think so.
It was Cameron just saying again, is that where time-lapse photography would come in?
I don't know. I mean, I do a lot of time-lapse, so I didn't have time to fit it into this talk, but I do a lot of time-lapse of the clouds and the sky. Not so much in summer because it's just not as much fun, but as soon as it comes into autumn and winter, my Instagram feed is full of time lapses every day. So yeah, I could. I'm just trying to think how the two of those would combine, because I guess there's some relationship to, like, some of my time lapses I've got cars going back into, so I'm not doing the light painting, but the cars are kind of doing it for you. But it would be interesting to combine the two for sure. And I did used to do my time lapses. In fact, there's a time lapse that goes with that Xero Footprint project, which you can, I think you would find it on Vimeo as well. And that was all done using the precision interval meter on my, my DSLR camera. But I must admit these days that you can just set your iPhone out and hit the time-lapse button and get something pretty much just as good. And then you don't have all that time afterwards at the computer, putting it all together, chopping the file sizes down. So I tend to just do it that way these days.
Well, thank you very much. It's actually 8:30, would you believe it? So we've gone right to the wire. So if there are no sort of last questions, I would just love to thank you, Morag, for opening Flow Festival 2021 for us with such a fabulous talk, lots of inspiration, lots of really lovely positive comments in the chat. And I thought I might just share, obviously your details are shared on the Eventbrite, but your sort of contact details just at your info address at Gleaming and Paterson. Is that okay?
Yeah, so sure, absolutely.
If anyone does have questions for you, they can drop you an email if there's anything they want to follow up on. And on your website, there's lots of projects that you and Ted have done together around some of the work you've done tonight, but other things as well, so to further inspire. So thank you very much. That's been wonderful. And thanks to everyone for coming along. Fabulous turnout for our first ever Zoom talk of Flow 2021, and hope to see some of you at some of the later talks. And Ted will be talking on Wednesday night, same time, same place.